Elena did not look at me when she cast the final vote to strip me of my own company. 30 years of my life, erased by a single breath from my own flesh and blood. Marcus, my son-in-law, adjusted his silk tie and smiled. It was a slow and victorious smirk that made my stomach turn. He stood at the head of the long mahogany table, my table, the table I purchased when this architectural empire was just a fragile dream. Now he was standing in my place, holding a stack of forged financial audits, accusing me of the absolute worst crime imaginable. "The evidence is undeniable," Marcus said. His voice echoed in the cavernous boardroom, dripping with fake sorrow. "Millions of dollars from the employee retirement accounts have been systematically diverted into private offshore trusts controlled solely by the founder." I looked around the room. 12 board members sat in heavy leather chairs, men and women I had mentored. People whose careers I had built from absolutely nothing. Now, they refused to meet my eyes. Some stared at their notepads, others looked at the floor. The betrayal hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The rain battered against the floor-to-ceiling windows, blurring the city skyline I had literally helped design. "That is a lie," I said. My voice was dangerously calm, though my chest felt like it was caving in. "Those trusts are the charitable foundations we set up last year. Marcus, you drafted those exact transfer documents yourself." "I drafted what you ordered me to draft," Marcus replied smoothly. He did not even blink. I had no idea the source of the funds was stolen, not until the independent audit this morning. An independent audit conducted by his friends, no doubt. The trap was so perfectly constructed, I realized with a sickening clarity just how long he had been planning this execution. He had spent the last 2 years isolating me from the daily operations, convincing me to step back and enjoy my age, convincing me to let him and Elena handle the minor details. The minor details were the ropes he used to hang me. I turned my gaze away from the snake and looked at my daughter, Elena, my only child. I had raised her alone after her father left us with nothing but heavy debts and a broken home. I remembered working 16 hours a day, sleeping on the floor of a damp drafting room, just so she could go to the best private schools. I built this massive firm brick by brick, so she would never know the taste of poverty. I gave her everything. She sat right beside Marcus, her hands folded perfectly in her lap. She was wearing the diamond necklace I gave her on her wedding day, the exact same day I welcomed that parasite into our family with open arms and a full heart. "Elena," I said. My voice wavered for the first time. The mother in me was bleeding out right there on the corporate carpet. Tell them where that money went. You know the truth. You know I would never steal from our people." The room went completely silent. Only the faint hum of the air conditioning broke the tension. Every eye shifted toward my daughter. I waited for her to defend me. I waited for her to slam her hands on the table and throw Marcus out of the building. Surely she knew this was a setup. Surely my little girl would not let this happen. Elena finally lifted her head. Her eyes were blank. Cold. It was like looking at a stranger wearing my daughter's face. "I have seen the documents, Mother," she said. Her voice did not shake at all. There was no hesitation, no guilt. "The numbers do not lie. You made a terrible mistake, and the board must act to protect the shareholders." A sharp ringing noise filled my ears. The world tilted on its axis. Did she just say that? Did my own daughter just condemn me to ruin? "It is time for you to step down," Elena continued, her tone as clinical as a machine. "For the good of the company, if you leave quietly, we will not press criminal charges. We will allow you to retire with a small allowance, but you must leave this building today. Security will escort you out." The cruelty of her words hit me harder than a physical blow. She was not just firing me, she was threatening me with prison if I fought back. She was publicly humiliating me in front of my peers. My own daughter, the child I had sacrificed my youth to protect, was now stepping on my neck to elevate her husband. I looked back at Marcus. His smile was wider now. He had won. He had manipulated my daughter, turned the board against me, and stolen my life's work in a single morning. They expected me to scream. They expected me to cry, to beg. to throw a hysterical fit right here in front of the executives. They wanted me to look crazy and unstable. It would only validate their decision and make their coup look like a necessary rescue mission. I closed my eyes for one brief second. I let the pain wash over me, let it burn through my veins, and then I locked it away. The tears stopped before they could even form. The trembling in my hands ceased. I was not just a mother anymore. I was the architect of this entire empire, and they had just made the biggest mistake of their pathetic lives. They thought taking the chief executive title meant taking my power. They had no idea what I had hidden in the dark. I stood up slowly. The chair scraped against the hardwood floor. The board members flinched, bracing for an explosion. I did not give them the satisfaction. I looked directly at Elena. I did not see my daughter anymore. I only saw an enemy who had chosen her side. I reached up to my lapel and unclasped the gold founder's pin, letting it drop from my fingers to hit the polished wood table before turning my back and walking out the door. The drive back to the estate was a blur of gray rain and flashing city lights. For 20 years, the towering iron gates of that mansion had been my absolute sanctuary. I had designed every single pillar, every archway, every sprawling garden path with my own two hands. It was meant to be an unbreakable fortress for my family. Now, it was just another beautiful thing they had stolen from me. When I pushed the heavy oak doors open, the silence of the massive house felt entirely different. It felt deeply hostile. The household staff, people I had employed and treated like extended family for over a decade, suddenly found sudden reasons to look at the marble floor. They scurried away into the long corridors, carrying silver trays and fresh linens, pretending they did not see the founder of the empire walking in like a ghost. Marcus had probably already called ahead. He had probably already asserted his aggressive new dominance over my own home. I walked up the grand, sweeping staircase for the very last time. I did not take the expensive vintage jewelry. I did not take the custom designer gowns or the priceless oil paintings that lined the velvet walls. I simply pulled a small, worn leather suitcase from the dusty back of my closet. I packed 3 basic changes of clothes. I packed the tarnished silver drafting compass I used to design my first successful skyscraper. And finally, I packed a small silver-framed photograph. It was a picture of a young woman with dark, tired eyes, holding a little girl missing her 2 front teeth. Elena was smiling so brightly in that picture. She was looking at me like I was a superhero. My chest tightened so painfully, I had to grip the edge of the mahogany dresser just to stay upright. How did we get here? How did that sweet, innocent child turn into the cold corporate executive who just ordered my public execution? I remembered the brutal years of grinding poverty after her father vanished into thin air. I remembered the freezing winters in a tiny studio apartment with broken radiators. I used to wrap Elena in my only heavy winter coat while I sat at a drafting table for 16 hours straight. My fingers would go completely numb. My eyes would burn relentlessly from staring at complex blueprints under a flickering fluorescent bulb. I built this architectural empire out of sheer, desperate terror, the terror that my daughter would go hungry. I swore on my life she would never know the bitter humiliation of being poor. I gave her the finest overseas education, the luxury cars, the endless premium credit cards. I gave her the world on a silver platter, and she took that platter and smashed it across my face to please a mediocre, greedy man. I snapped the suitcase shut. The metallic sound echoed loudly in the empty master bedroom. I walked downstairs, placed my heavy brass house keys quietly on the entryway table, and walked out into the freezing rain. I did not look back. By nightfall, I was sitting on a stiff, lumpy mattress in a cramped, one-bedroom apartment on the industrial side of the city. The cheap wallpaper was peeling at the edges. The rusted heater rattled with a metallic cough. It was a place I had rented under a fake corporate name years ago, a quiet, secret retreat for when the boardroom noise became too loud. Nobody knew about it, not even my daughter. For 3 entire days, I did not leave that room. I sat in the dim, flickering light, drinking bitter instant coffee, letting the sheer magnitude of the betrayal wash over my skin. It was a severe physical ache, a heavy, suffocating pressure crushing my lungs, but I absolutely refused to cry. Tears were a comforting luxury for people who actually had someone to hold them. I had absolutely no one. On the morning of the fourth day, I finally turned on the small television resting on a plastic crate. The premier financial news network was broadcasting live from the grand glass lobby of my company. My company. The banner flashing across the bottom of the screen read in bold red letters, "A new era of transparency following embezzlement scandal." There he was, Marcus. He was wearing a custom-tailored Italian suit I had probably paid for, standing at the glass podium with a sickening posture of fake humility. He looked so incredibly sad, so heavily burdened by the terrible financial truth he had heroically uncovered. "It is a profoundly dark day for our corporate family," Marcus said into the dense cluster of microphones. His voice was smooth, highly practiced, entirely devoid of genuine emotion. "We trusted our brilliant founder. We believed blindly in her vision. But the independent audits have revealed a shocking, systematic breach of trust. Millions of dollars secretly stolen from the very workers who built this company. As the new chief executive, I promise you this: we will relentlessly track and recover those funds, and we will restore the integrity of this great institution." The camera smoothly panned to the side. Elena stepped forward into the bright lights. She placed a highly calculated, comforting hand on her husband's shoulder. The rapid flashes from the press cameras illuminated her perfectly contoured face. She looked directly into the lens. "It breaks my heart," Elena said softly. She actually managed to force a single, trembling tear to fall down her cheek. "My mother is deeply unwell. Her mental judgment has been failing for years. While we are choosing not to press criminal charges out of respect for her past contributions, we had to step in aggressively to stop the financial bleeding." I stared at the glowing screen, my own flesh and blood. She was standing in the lobby I designed, wearing the flawless diamonds I bought her, destroying my lifelong reputation in front of millions of people. They were intentionally painting me as a senile, greedy, highly unstable old woman. They were making absolutely sure I could never work in this industry again. They wanted me permanently erased from the history books. A strange, foreign sensation began to spread deeply through my chest. The suffocating pain, the unbearable weight of a mother's completely broken heart. It slowly began to freeze over. The crippling sadness evaporated into the damp air, leaving behind a terrifying, icy calm. They truly thought they had won. They thought that because they held the impressive titles and the corporate bank accounts, they actually held the power. They thought I was just a broken old woman who would wither away in the dark shadows and die of public shame. They were so incredibly arrogant. They had completely forgotten the most fundamental rule of architecture. If you do not own the foundation, the house does not belong to you. I reached for the remote and turned off the television, plunging the small room back into heavy silence. Did my blind sacrifice build an empire only to raise a monster? The freezing temperature in the small apartment was actually a blessing. It kept my mind sharp. It kept the suffocating grief from completely taking over my lungs. I sat on the edge of the lumpy mattress for a long time, staring at the blank screen of the television after turning off the news broadcast. Marcus and Elena thought they had successfully buried me alive. They thought my complete silence over the past 4 days was the pathetic surrender of a broken old woman. They were wrong. I was not surrendering. I was calculating. I stood up and walked over to the peeling radiator. My joints ached from the cold and the sheer stress of the betrayal, but my hands were entirely steady. I knelt on the scuffed wooden floor and pulled the old leather suitcase from under the bed. It was the same suitcase I had carried out of the mansion, the same one I used when I first moved to this city 30 years ago, completely penniless and clutching my infant daughter to my chest. I ran my fingers along the worn inner lining of the lid. There was a hidden zipper tucked deeply behind the fabric, nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to press. I pulled it open. Tucked securely inside was a flat, heavy, fireproof lockbox. I pulled it out and rested it on my lap. The cold metal felt grounding. It felt like an anchor pulling me back to reality. I reached up to my neck and pulled out a long silver chain hidden beneath my sweater. Attached to the chain was a small, intricately carved brass key. I had worn this key every single day for the last 2 decades. Even when I wore expensive designer gowns to corporate galas, this simple brass key was always resting against my skin. Elena used to ask me what it belonged to when she was a little girl. I always told her it was the key to our safety. She eventually stopped asking. Marcus never even noticed it. I inserted the key into the lockbox. The heavy mechanical click echoed in the silent room, sounding exactly like the cocking of a loaded weapon. I opened the heavy lid. Inside the box were no stacks of cash. There were no hidden gold bars or secret offshore bank account ledgers. There was only a thick stack of aged, yellowing parchment paper. These were the original incorporation documents. The real ones. I carefully lifted the first heavy folder. My hands finally began to tremble, but not from sorrow. It was the overwhelming weight of memory. I closed my eyes and was instantly transported back to a rainy evening 20 years ago. I was sitting in a dim, cigar smoke-filled office across from Arthur, my first corporate attorney and my closest confidant. Arthur had passed away over a decade ago, but his raspy, uncompromising voice still echoed crystal clear in my mind. "You are building a massive machine, my dear," Arthur had said, pointing a heavy pen at the blueprints scattered across his desk. "A machine that will generate hundreds of millions of dollars. But machines can be hijacked. Boards can be manipulated. Husbands can turn greedy, and children can disappoint you." I remembered arguing with him. I remembered telling him that I was building this entirely for my family. I told him Elena would never betray me. Arthur had just offered a sad, knowing smile. "Then prove me wrong by protecting yourself. Never put the core technology into the assets of the corporation. The structural engineering formulas, the proprietary artificial intelligence software that designs your sustainable buildings, the exact patents that make your firm utterly unique in the global market. Keep them in your own personal name, not the company name, yours. You will grant the corporation an exclusive operating license for $1 a year. If they ever try to take the company from you, they will only get the walls. You will keep the foundation." I opened my eyes and looked down at the documents resting on my lap. Arthur was right. My brilliant, paranoid friend had saved my life from beyond the grave. I traced my finger over the dense legal text, the exclusive operating license, the very heartbeat of the entire corporate empire. Buried deep within the archaic legal jargon was a single, irrevocable revocation clause. It stated clearly that in the event of a hostile change in leadership, or if my personal employment was terminated without mutual consent, the licensing agreement could be instantly revoked at my sole discretion. Without this specific intellectual property, the massive corporation Marcus and Elena just stole was absolutely worthless. It was nothing but an empty shell. They could not legally use the software. They could not construct the buildings. They could not even use the trademarked firm name. Every single active contract they held around the world would immediately go into severe legal default. They thought they had outsmarted me because Marcus spent 2 years altering financial records to frame me for embezzlement. He was a modern corporate shark who only looked at current balance sheets and public stock prices. He was far too arrogant to dig through 30 years of dusty legal archives in a basement vault. He assumed the founder was just a tired old woman who did not understand modern business. I held the absolute destruction of my own daughter in the palm of my hand. I could walk into a courthouse today, file the revocation, and watch their stolen empire instantly crumble into dust by sunset. The urge to do it was a violently burning fire in my throat. I wanted to see the smug smile wiped off Marcus's face. I wanted to see Elena realize that stepping on her mother's neck was a fatal mistake. But I slowly lowered the papers back into the iron box. No, not yet. If I activated the kill switch today, they would simply claim I forged the documents. They would use the stolen company funds to drag me through civil court for years. They would play the victims. To truly execute justice, I needed them to climb higher. I needed them to be so completely arrogant, so drunk on their false victory, that they would publicly commit themselves to a massive new venture. I needed them to put their own personal wealth on the line. When they reached the absolute peak of their overreach, that was when I would pull the foundation out from under them. The grieving, heartbroken mother was dead. She died on that boardroom carpet. Only the architect remained, and an architect knows exactly how to demolish a structure with a single, perfectly placed explosive. The silence of the room was suddenly shattered by a harsh, electronic buzzing. My heart skipped a painful beat. I looked over at the small wooden table. My old personal cellular phone, the one I thought they had disconnected, was vibrating violently against the wood. The bright screen illuminated the dark, peeling wallpaper. I walked over and stared down at the glowing text. It was a direct message from Elena. "We need to talk about your housing situation. Marcus and I are coming to your apartment in 1 hour. Do not leave." I had exactly 1 hour to prepare the stage. The iron lockbox went back into the hidden lining of the old suitcase. I shoved the suitcase deep beneath the lumpy mattress. Then, I began to dress the set. An architect knows that presentation dictates perception. If you want people to believe a building is abandoned, you do not just turn off the lights. You let the dust settle. You let the cold seep into the walls. I walked over to the rattling radiator and turned the rusty valve completely off. The freezing autumn air quickly took over the cramped apartment. I took off my neat blouse and put on an oversized, faded gray sweater that had been sitting in the back of my closet for over a decade. I pulled my hair out of its tight, professional bun, letting the gray strands hang loosely and messily around my tired face. I looked at my reflection in the cracked bathroom mirror. I looked old. I looked entirely defeated. I looked exactly like a woman who had just lost her life's work and her only child in the span of a single morning. It was the perfect disguise. When the sharp, aggressive knock finally came at the door, I made sure to walk slowly. I dragged my feet slightly across the scuffed wooden floor. I unlocked the deadbolt with a trembling hand and pulled the door open just a few inches. Marcus pushed the door the rest of the way open without asking for permission. He stepped into my small living room, wearing a charcoal wool suit that probably cost more than this entire building. He looked around at the peeling wallpaper, the cheap plastic crates, and the stained ceiling. His upper lip curled into a sneer of absolute disgust. Elena walked in right behind him. She was wearing a pristine white cashmere coat, clutching a highly expensive leather handbag to her chest, as if the very air in my apartment might infect her. She refused to meet my eyes. She stared at a water stain on the wall instead. "This place is completely depressing," Marcus said, his voice loud and booming in the small space. "But I suppose it is fitting, a modest place for a modest retirement." I wrapped my arms around myself, shivering violently. It was only half an act. The cold was biting, but the ice radiating from my own daughter was far worse. "Why are you here?" I asked. I pitched my voice low, making it sound raspy and weak. Marcus unbuttoned his suit jacket and pulled a thick manila envelope from his inner pocket. He tossed it carelessly onto the small, scratched wooden dining table. The heavy thud echoed in the quiet room. "We are here to finalize your exit," Marcus said smoothly. He pulled out a wooden chair, wiped the seat with his handkerchief, and sat down as if he were a king holding court in a peasant's hut. "The board has officially processed your termination. However, given your long history with the firm, and out of respect for my wife's feelings, we have decided to be generous." He slid a glossy white document out of the envelope, followed by a printed company check. "This is a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement," Marcus explained, tapping the paper with his expensive gold pen. "It states that you accept full responsibility for the financial discrepancies. It states that you will voluntarily step away from the industry forever. You will not speak to the press. You will not contact any board members. You will silently disappear. In exchange, we will not press criminal charges, and the company will provide you with a stipend of $4,000 a month for your living expenses. $4,000. To the woman who generated hundreds of millions. It was not just a low offer. It was a calculated, deliberate humiliation. I looked slowly at Elena. She was still staring at the wall. "Elena," I whispered, forcing my voice to crack, "is this what you want? You want your mother to sign a confession for a crime I did not commit? You want me to live on pennies in the dark?" Elena finally turned her head. Her eyes were completely void of warmth. There was no hesitation in her posture. "You brought this on yourself," she said coldly. "You became too greedy. You lost touch with reality. Marcus is actually saving you from a federal prison sentence. You should be thanking him. Just sign the paper and let us move on with our lives." The betrayal cut through me again, sharp and breathless. I had carried her in my arms when she was burning with fever. I had starved myself so she could eat. And now, she was standing in my freezing apartment, calling me a criminal to protect a man who was stealing our legacy. "And if I refuse?" I asked, looking back at Marcus. Marcus smiled. It was the smile of a predator who knows the prey has nowhere to run. "If you refuse, I will call the authorities before I even reach the lobby of this building. I will hand over the audit. They will freeze your personal bank accounts immediately. You will not even have money to buy a cup of coffee tomorrow morning. You will be dragged out of this pathetic room in handcuffs on national television. So, please, refuse." He held the gold pen out to me. I stared at the pen. I let the silence stretch. I made my hands shake violently. I let out a soft, pathetic sob. I wanted them to feel the absolute peak of their artificial power. I wanted them to firmly believe that they had completely broken my spirit. Because I knew something Marcus did not know. I knew that signing an agreement with a corporation is completely useless when that corporation is about to lose its fundamental right to exist. This non-disclosure agreement only protected the shell. It did absolutely nothing to protect them from the intellectual property revocation clause hidden in my lockbox. I reached out and took the pen. My fingers trembled so hard I nearly dropped it. I leaned over the scratch table and signed my name on the dotted line. My signature was intentionally jagged and weak. Marcus snatched the paper back immediately. He slipped it into his envelope with a look of supreme triumph. "A very wise decision," Marcus said, standing up and buttoning his jacket. "Enjoy your retirement. You will not be hearing from us again. We are far too busy. Next week, we are announcing a massive international merger with the Sterling Group. We are taking the firm global, something you were always too afraid to do." He turned and walked toward the door. Elena followed him without saying a single word. She did not say goodbye. She did not look back. The heavy door clicked shut, plunging the apartment back into complete silence. The moment the lock clicked, my hands instantly stopped shaking. My tears dried up. The pathetic, broken old woman vanished into thin air, leaving only the architect standing in the freezing room. Marcus had just given me exactly what I needed: the Sterling Group merger. He was about to leverage the stolen company to borrow hundreds of millions of dollars on an international stage. He was walking blindly into the greatest trap I could have ever designed. I looked down at the table. The company check for $4,000 was sitting there, a mocking symbol of their supposed victory. I picked up the check, walked over to the small electric paper shredder in the corner of the room, and pushed the paper into the metal teeth without blinking. The next morning, the financial world exploded with the news. Marcus had not wasted a single second. I sat on my lumpy mattress, wrapped in my heavy sweater, and listened to the cheap plastic radio resting on the floor. The Sterling Group, a massive international conglomerate based in London, had officially agreed to a global merger with my former firm. The radio announcer read the press release with breathless excitement. The merger was valued at over $800 million, but the true prize, the announcer explained, was our firm's proprietary artificial intelligence structural design software and our exclusive patents on sustainable building materials. The Sterling Group wanted our technology to build entirely new smart cities across Europe and Asia. I closed my eyes and let out a slow, trembling breath. My technology, my patents, the very assets Arthur had secured under my personal name 2 decades ago. Marcus was selling something he did not own. He was packaging my entire life's work and presenting it as his own brilliant corporate strategy. I needed to know exactly how deep they were digging their own graves. I needed the actual financial filings. I picked up my cellular phone and dialed a number I had memorized 15 years ago. William was the only board member who had looked at the floor instead of glaring at me during my termination. He was a coward, yes, but he was a cowardly man with a crippling, guilty conscience. We agreed to meet at a rundown diner on the edge of the city limits, far away from the polished glass towers of the financial district. When William slid into the vinyl booth across from me, he looked absolutely terrified. He kept glancing at the door, pulling his trench coat tight around his shoulders. He slid a thick leather briefcase under the table, his hands shaking slightly. "I should not be here," William whispered, his eyes darting nervously toward the waitress. "If Marcus finds out I am speaking to you, he will ruin me. He has purged the entire senior staff. Anyone loyal to you is already gone. He replaced them with his own private wealth managers. Marcus is too busy posing for magazine covers to care about an old woman eating pie in the suburbs," I said softly. I kept my voice weak and raspy. I hunched my shoulders forward, making myself look small. I needed William to believe I was utterly defeated, so he would not hesitate to share the truth. "Did you bring the merger documents? Please, William, I just need to know what they are doing with my legacy." William let out a heavy sigh. He opened the briefcase and slid a thick stack of printed contracts across the sticky table. "It is worse than you think," William said. His voice was filled with genuine pity. "They are not just merging. Marcus and Elena are leveraging the entire firm. They borrowed $300 million from international banks to finance the global expansion before the merger even finalizes. They want to show the Sterling Group they can scale up operations immediately." I stared at the papers. My heart began to pound a heavy, rhythmic beat against my ribs. $300 million? The company does not have that kind of liquid collateral. William shook his head slowly. "That is the craziest part. The banks demanded intense personal guarantees because of the recent embezzlement scandal, the scandal they blamed on you. So Marcus and Elena signed personal liability clauses. If this merger fails, if those international contracts are breached, the banks will not just take the company, they will take Marcus and Elena's personal wealth, the mansion, their private offshore accounts, everything. They have bet their actual lives on this technology transfer." I reached out and touched the contract. My fingers traced the signature lines. Elena had actually signed her name right next to his. She had tied her entire future, her absolute freedom, to the very patents I held secretly in a rusted iron box under my bed. My own daughter. I had spent 30 years trying to protect her from the harsh consequences of poverty. And now she was eagerly signing away her own life to please a greedy man. Did she even read the foundational charter? Did she even bother to check who actually owned the soul of the company? No. She was too blinded by the flashing cameras and the illusion of supreme power. "They are moving incredibly fast," William continued, completely oblivious to the massive storm brewing in my mind. "The final signing ceremony with the Sterling Group executives is in exactly 2 weeks. It will be the biggest media event in the industry's history. I am so sorry. But they have truly won. You need to take your stipend and disappear. You cannot fight this kind of money." I looked up at William. I let a single, pathetic tear slide down my cheek. It was a masterpiece of a performance. "You are right," I whispered, pulling the documents toward my chest. "I have nothing left to fight with. Thank you for giving me closure, William. Go back to the office. Do not let them suspect you." William stood up, gave me one last look of profound sadness, and hurried out into the cold rain. The moment the diner door swung shut, I wiped the fake tear from my face. My posture instantly straightened. The frail, broken old woman vanished completely, and the architect returned. $300 million in personal liability. If I had activated the kill switch last week, Marcus and Elena would have simply been fired by the board for losing the company's core assets. They would have walked away humiliated, but they would have still kept their stolen millions. They would have kept the mansion. They would have survived to ruin someone else. But now they were signing international treaties promising to deliver technology they had absolutely no legal right to use. When the Sterling Group realized the company they were buying was an empty shell, the breach of contract lawsuits would be apocalyptic. The international banks would instantly call in the massive loans. Marcus and Elena would not just go bankrupt, they would face federal prison for defrauding foreign investors. They had built a magnificent, towering skyscraper of lies, and they had built it entirely on my hidden foundation. All I had to do was pull the licensing agreement, and the entire structure would collapse directly onto their heads. I gathered the documents and walked back to my freezing apartment. I did not turn on the heater. I did not turn on the television. I sat at the scratched wooden table, reviewing every single clause of their impending doom. I was no longer angry. Anger is loud, sloppy, and reckless. I was something much colder. I was patient. I would let them buy the expensive champagne. I would let them tailor their custom suits for the grand signing ceremony. I would let them stand at the very edge of the highest cliff they could possibly find. An architect knows that a foundation built on sand looks identical to one built on stone right up until the earthquake hits. I did not need to swing a wrecking ball to destroy their stolen castle. I only needed to wait for the wind to blow. The cold wind whipped through the narrow streets as I walked toward the neighborhood pharmacy. My hands were buried deep inside the pockets of my heavy gray sweater. My joints ached terribly. It was a deep, throbbing pain in my knuckles and knees. A permanent souvenir from 30 long years of hunching over drafting tables in freezing, unheated rooms before I finally built my empire. I needed my medication. It was a highly specialized prescription for severe arthritis, something my corporate health insurance had covered without question for the past decade. I stepped out of the freezing rain and into the brightly lit pharmacy. The young woman behind the counter smiled warmly as I handed her my premium platinum insurance card. She typed the information into her computer. A moment later, her smile faltered. She frowned, pressing a few more buttons on her keyboard. "I am so sorry, ma'am," the young woman said softly, her eyes filled with genuine pity. "The system says this policy was officially terminated yesterday afternoon. It has been completely canceled by the primary account holder." I stared at her. "Canceled? Are you absolutely sure?" "Yes, ma'am," she replied, turning the screen slightly so I could see the glaring red text. "If you want to pay out of pocket, the total comes to $850 for a 1-month supply. $850. Nearly a fourth of the pathetic monthly stipend Marcus had forced me to accept. I looked down at my swollen hands. They had perfectly anticipated this. Marcus and Elena did not just want to steal my life's work. They wanted to humiliate me. They wanted to squeeze me until I was physically broken, unable to afford basic comfort, entirely dependent on their twisted mercy. "Never mind," I whispered. "I will come back another time." I walked back out into the bitter cold. I did not go straight home. I found an empty wooden bench in a small, gray park and sat down. The freezing rain soaked right through my sweater, but I barely felt it. A strange, heavy silence settled over my mind. Up until this exact moment, a tiny, foolish part of my heart had still been hoping for a miracle. A pathetic, lingering whisper of maternal instinct telling me that maybe Elena was just confused. Maybe she was brainwashed by Marcus. Maybe, deep down underneath the diamonds and the corporate titles, my little girl was still there. I needed to know. I needed to cross this final boundary before I burned their entire world to the ground. I pulled my cellular phone from my pocket. My fingers were stiff and trembling from the cold. I dialed Elena's private personal number, the number she only gave to family. It rang once, twice, 3 times. "Make it quick," Elena's voice snapped through the speaker. There was no greeting, no warmth, just the sharp, impatient tone of an executive who had been slightly inconvenienced. "I have an international strategy meeting in exactly 5 minutes. "Elena," I said. I let my voice crack. I did not hide the shivering in my breath. "I am at the pharmacy. My medical insurance has been completely shut off." A heavy sigh echoed through the phone. I could hear the faint sound of a silver spoon stirring a porcelain coffee cup in the background. Yes, Mother, Elena said smoothly. That is standard procedure. Marcus is executing a massive corporate restructuring. We are cutting all legacy overhead to maximize our leverage for the Sterling Group merger. You are no longer an employee, you are a liability. I am your mother, I pleaded, the desperation in my voice completely real. The sheer cruelty of her words was a physical knife in my chest. I built the fund that pays for that insurance. I need my medication, Elena. My hands are in terrible pain. I cannot even hold a pen. Then do not hold a pen, she replied instantly. Her voice was colder than the freezing rain soaking my clothes. You are retired. You signed the exit agreement. If you need cheap medication, go to a public charity clinic. Do not call this number again. I am blocking you. The line went completely dead. Click. I sat on the frozen wooden bench, holding the silent phone against my ear. The rain continued to fall, washing away the dirt from the pavement. And in that quiet, desolate moment, the grieving mother finally died. She died completely. Every ounce of guilt, every shred of hesitation, every lingering memory of the little girl with the missing front teeth, it all vanished into the freezing wind. I did not feel sad anymore. I did not feel betrayed. I felt entirely liberated. Elena had just handed me the absolute permission to destroy her. She had chosen her side. She had traded her own flesh and blood for a temporary illusion of power. I lowered the phone and slipped it back into my pocket. My posture straightened. The throbbing pain in my hands suddenly felt completely irrelevant. I stood up and walked back to my apartment with a steady, calculated stride. The architect was now in complete control. When I reached my tiny, damp room, I did not turn on the lights. I walked straight to the bed, pulled out the heavy leather suitcase, and extracted the iron lockbox. I unlocked it with the brass key hanging around my neck. The heavy lid opened, revealing the yellowing foundation documents. It was time. They had pushed all their chips to the center of the table. They had signed the personal liability clauses. They had committed themselves to the Sterling Group. And they had proudly severed their last remaining tie to my humanity. I pulled a blank sheet of expensive, watermarked stationery from the bottom of the box. I took out my favorite drafting pen. My hands were no longer shaking. I began to write the formal legal revocation of the exclusive operating license. Every single word was a perfectly placed explosive charge. I would finish the letter tonight. Tomorrow morning, I would take it to the highest intellectual property court in the city. I was halfway through the second paragraph when a sudden, violent pounding echoed through the apartment. It was not a polite knock. It was the desperate, heavy sound of fists hammering against thin wood. The door rattled violently on its cheap hinges. I froze, my pen hovering right over the paper. Nobody knew where I lived except Marcus and Elena and William. Open the door. A frantic voice screamed from the hallway, muffled by the peeling wood. Please, open the door. It was William, but his voice was completely terrified, cracking with sheer panic. I slid the documents back into the iron box, locked it swiftly, and hurried to the door. The moment I unbolted the lock, the door burst open. William fell into the room, gasping for air. His expensive trench coat was ripped at the shoulder. His face was entirely pale, slick with cold sweat, and he was clutching a crumpled folder to his chest like a shield. "William, what happened?" I demanded, pulling him inside and locking the door behind him. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with absolute horror. "They moved it," William gasped, pointing a shaking finger at the crumpled folder. Marcus found out the federal regulators were asking questions. He panicked. "The signing ceremony is not next week." William grabbed my arms, his grip bruising my skin. "The merger. They are signing it in 2 hours." William was hyperventilating. His chest heaved violently as he leaned against the peeling wallpaper of my small apartment. I looked at the crumpled folder in his trembling hands. The entire timeline had completely collapsed. Marcus was not waiting for next week. He was rushing the international merger to hide the missing funds from the federal financial regulators. He was forcing the absolute climax of his betrayal today, right now. I grabbed William by his wet shoulders. My grip was shockingly tight. He flinched, looking up at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Breathe, William," I commanded. My voice dropped all pretenses of a frail old woman. "Tell me exactly where this is happening." "The grand glass atrium," William gasped out. "At the headquarters. Marcus invited 200 financial journalists. He wants to sign the $300 million liability contracts live on national television to boost the stock price before the market closes. 2 hours. I had exactly 2 hours to drop the guillotine. I let go of William and walked straight to the scratched wooden table. I did not stumble. I did not shiver. I unlocked the heavy iron box with the brass key hanging securely from my neck. I pulled out the formal legal revocation of the exclusive operating license. The ink from my drafting pen was completely dry. It was a flawless legal execution. I picked up my cellular phone and dialed a highly secure number I had not called in 3 years. It rang exactly 1 time before a sharp, deep voice answered. "Thomas," I said clearly. There was a heavy pause on the other end of the line. Thomas was the most ruthless intellectual property litigator in the entire city. I had kept him fully on retainer in absolute secrecy for decades, waiting in the shadows for a nightmare scenario just like this. "I was beginning to wonder if you would ever let me off the leash, madam," Thomas replied smoothly. "The time has come," I told him. "Execute the kill switch. File the emergency injunction with the federal court right this second. Bring the federal marshals to the grand atrium." "With immense pleasure," Thomas said. "I will see you in exactly 1 hour." I hung up the phone. The legal mechanism was locked. There were absolutely no loopholes. Once the injunction was filed, the massive corporation Marcus and Elena stole would instantly lose the legal right to use my software, my patents, and my building materials. The corporate shell would instantly crack. But I needed to ensure the blast radius hit the international banks immediately. I needed the Sterling Group to see the exact moment the company became completely worthless. I pulled a thick, sealed envelope from the bottom of the iron box. It contained the certified copies of my original patents. "William," I said, turning to the terrified board member, "I need you to send a secure courier message to the Chief Compliance Officer of the Sterling Group. Send it right now. Tell them to check the Federal Intellectual Property Registry before they sign a single piece of paper on that stage." William stared at the envelope. He looked from the documents to my face, his jaw trembling violently. You still own the foundation," he whispered in complete shock. "They are leveraging $300 million in personal loans on technology they do not even own." "And Elena co-signed the personal liability," I replied coldly. "They dug their own graves. I am simply going to hand them the shovels." William took the envelope with shaking hands. "Marcus is going to face federal prison for this." "That is the consequence of trying to bury an architect," I said. I walked into the freezing bathroom and pulled the harsh string of the overhead light. I stared at my reflection in the cracked mirror. I slowly stripped off the heavy, faded gray sweater. I splashed ice-cold water over my face, washing away the exhausted, defeated mother who had cried in this very room just a few days ago. I reached under my bed and opened the hidden compartment of my leather suitcase. I pulled out a perfectly tailored, sharp black blazer. I slipped it onto my shoulders. I pinned the heavy gold founder's crest directly onto my lapel. I pulled my loose, messy silver hair back into a severe, perfectly tight bun. I slipped on my heavy leather boots. When I walked back into the living room, William actually took a massive step back. The broken old woman was completely gone. The creator of the empire had returned to claim her stolen throne. "Drive me to the headquarters, William," I ordered. There was absolutely no room for debate in my tone. The drive through the financial district was completely silent. The freezing rain lashed heavily against the windshield of William's car. I watched the towering glass skyscrapers pass by. I had designed 4 of those massive structures. I knew exactly how much pressure a glass facade could take before it shattered into a million pieces. Marcus and Elena were about to experience that exact pressure firsthand. I thought about Elena. My beautiful, brilliant daughter. She had looked at me with such absolute disgust when she forced me out of my own company. She had coldly cut off my medical insurance just hours ago, treating my physical pain as an acceptable corporate expense. She truly believed she was untouchable. She believed that stepping on her mother's neck would elevate her to the absolute top of the world. She had entirely forgotten who taught her how to climb in the first place. We pulled up to the towering corporate headquarters. The street was entirely blocked by dozens of flashing news vans. Bright camera lights cut heavily through the dark rain. Security guards in tailored black suits lined the red carpet leading up to the grand glass doors. They were heavily guarding a highly anticipated corporate coronation. They had absolutely no idea they were guarding a public execution. I stepped out of the car. The bitter wind bit at my face, but I did not flinch. I walked straight toward the wet red carpet. The massive security guards moved aggressively to block me, but the moment they recognized my sharp gaze, they completely froze. Their eyes widened in absolute panic. They had spent years taking my orders. Their muscle memory overpowered Marcus's new directives. They slowly stepped aside, parting quietly, allowing the founder to walk right through her own front doors. I walked across the polished marble lobby. The deafening sound of wild applause and popping champagne corks echoed from the grand atrium ahead. The trap was fully loaded. I paused just outside the heavy oak doors, listening to Marcus speaking smoothly into a microphone, completely drunk on his stolen power. I placed my hands on the cold brass handles, preparing to push them open. Is completely destroying my own daughter the only way to expose the ultimate price of the truth? The grand glass atrium was entirely blinding. Hundreds of camera flashes erupted like a continuous lightning storm, bouncing off the polished marble floors and the towering structural columns I had personally designed. The room was packed with financial journalists, elite investors, and the entire senior executive board of the Sterling Group. Waiters in pristine white tuxedos wove through the massive crowd, carrying silver trays loaded with crystal glasses of imported champagne. At the very center of the room, elevated on a sleek black stage, sat a long mahogany table. It was the exact same table where they had voted to destroy my life. Now, it was draped in velvet and covered in thick leather binders containing the $300 million merger agreements. Marcus was standing at the podium, gripping the edges with supreme arrogance. He was wearing his custom-tailored suit, smiling so widely it looked physically painful. Elena sat perfectly beside him, wearing a stunning red designer dress, her neck glittering with heavy diamonds. She looked exactly like a queen, waiting for her final crown. "This is not just a merger," Marcus announced to the crowd, his voice booming smoothly through the state-of-the-art sound system. "This is the dawn of a completely new global era. By combining our proprietary artificial intelligence architecture with the immense global reach of the Sterling Group, we will literally build the future." The crowd erupted into deafening applause. The chief executive of the Sterling Group, an older British man with sharp eyes, stood up and shook Marcus's hand. He reached for the heavy gold pen resting on the contract. It was the absolute peak of their false victory. They were seconds away from securing their stolen empire. I pushed the heavy oak doors fully open. The heavy brass hinges let out a low, deep groan that somehow cut entirely through the cheering. I did not rush. I did not shout. I simply walked down the center aisle, my heavy leather boots clicking sharply against the marble floor. I wore the sharp black blazer and the solid gold founder's crest pinned directly over my heart. The journalists near the back noticed me first. The cameras slowly stopped flashing. A strange, heavy ripple of confused silence began to spread rapidly through the massive room. People started whispering. The crowd naturally parted, stepping out of my way, as if the temperature in the room had suddenly dropped to freezing. Marcus looked up from the podium. His victorious smile instantly froze. His face went completely pale, draining of all blood in a single second. What is she doing here?" Marcus hissed into the microphone, completely forgetting to cover it. The sound echoed awkwardly across the silent atrium. He looked frantically toward the edges of the room. "Security! Remove this woman from the building. She is a trespasser. The heavily armed security guards standing by the walls did absolutely nothing. They simply stared at the floor. They knew exactly who truly built this building. Elena stood up, her chair scraping loudly. Her eyes were wide with sudden, unexplainable panic. She looked at my sharp posture, my tight silver bun, the coldness in my eyes, and she finally realized she was not looking at a broken old woman anymore. Before Marcus could yell for security again, the heavy oak doors swung open a second time. Thomas strode into the room. He was wearing a flawless navy suit, carrying a single red folder. Flanking him on either side were two uniformed federal marshals, their hands resting cautiously near their utility belts. The entire room erupted into frantic murmurs. The journalists instantly aimed their heavy lenses at the federal officers. Marcus gripped the podium so hard his knuckles turned entirely white. What is the meaning of this? This is a private corporate event. Thomas ignored him completely. He walked straight past the podium and approached the chief legal officer of the Sterling Group, who was already frowning deeply at his cellular phone. William's warning message had clearly arrived. "Gentlemen," Thomas said. His voice was not loud, but it carried absolute, terrifying authority. He placed the red folder directly on top of the merger contracts. "I represent the sole legal owner of the architectural patents, the artificial intelligence source code, and all proprietary structural engineering formulas associated with this firm. I am serving you with a federal emergency injunction. The exclusive operating license granted to this corporate shell has been officially and irrevocably revoked." The Sterling Group executive stared at the paper. Then, he looked up at Marcus with a gaze of pure, freezing rage. "Is this true?" the executive demanded, his voice shaking with raw anger. "Did you leverage $300 million of international funding on technology you do not legally own?" Marcus was sweating profusely. He stammered, pulling at his expensive silk tie. "No, that is impossible. The company owns the assets. We checked the ledgers. She is lying. She is a completely unstable woman." "You checked the corporate ledgers," Thomas corrected smoothly, turning to face the flashing cameras. "You did not check the foundational charter. My client owns the intellectual property under her personal name. You merely held a temporary operating license, a license she just terminated today. This company currently owns absolutely nothing but office furniture and heavy, inescapable debt." The entire room exploded. Journalists shouted questions all at once. The camera flashes became a blinding, chaotic strobe light. The Sterling executive slammed the gold pen down on the table. "You arrogant fools," he spat at Marcus and Elena. "You committed federal fraud. You lied to our investors. This deal is entirely dead, and our attorneys will see you in federal court by Monday morning." He tore the merger contract exactly in half and threw it onto the marble floor. The Sterling delegation immediately stood up and marched out of the room, leaving the broken papers scattered like garbage. It was over. In less than 3 minutes, the magnificent skyscraper of lies completely collapsed. The international banks would immediately call in the massive loans. The personal liability clauses Marcus and Elena signed just hours ago were now fully active. They were not just fired, they were hundreds of millions of dollars in debt, and they were going to federal prison. Marcus collapsed into his leather chair. He buried his face in his trembling hands, openly sobbing as the reality of his absolute destruction crushed his lungs. The journalists swarmed the stage like hungry wolves, shouting aggressive questions about the fraud, recording his humiliating breakdown live for the entire world to see. Elena did not cry. She stood frozen, her perfect face contorted in sheer terror. She slowly stepped down from the stage and walked toward me. Her hands were shaking violently. The expensive diamonds on her neck suddenly looked like a heavy, suffocating chain. "Mother," Elena whispered, her voice cracking, pleading for the mercy she had brutally denied me just hours ago. "Please, you cannot do this. They will take the house. They will take everything we have. We will go to jail." I looked at my only daughter. I felt absolutely nothing. The emotional architecture of my love for her had been completely demolished, and I had no intention of ever rebuilding it. She reached out a trembling hand, desperately grabbing the sleeve of my sharp black blazer to beg for her absolute life. I brushed her hand off my sleeve with a sharp, unconscious flick of my wrist and turned away into the flashing lights. 3 weeks passed. The collapse of the architectural empire was absolute and entirely merciless. Without the foundational software and the proprietary building patents, the massive corporate shell fractured into a million useless pieces. The international banks showed absolutely no hesitation. They called in the $300 million personal liability loans immediately. Marcus was arrested by federal agents on a rainy Tuesday morning, dragged out of my former mansion in silver handcuffs, facing decades in federal prison for international corporate fraud. I remained in my small, peeling apartment. I did not turn on the television to watch his heavily broadcasted downfall. I simply sat at my scratched wooden table, sipping warm tea, finalizing the legal transfer of my life's work into a permanent charitable trust. Then, the fragile knock came at my door. It was not the aggressive, entitled pounding from before. It was weak, desperate. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. Elena stood in the dim hallway. She looked completely hollow. The pristine white cashmere coat was gone. The heavy diamond necklace was gone. She was shivering, clutching a cheap plastic grocery bag containing whatever meager belongings the federal regulators had allowed her to keep. "Mother," Elena whispered. Her voice broke completely. Tears streamed down her pale, exhausted face. "They took the house. They froze my personal accounts. Marcus is gone, and I have absolutely nowhere to sleep tonight. Please, I am your daughter. You have your foundation. You have your wealth. Please let me come home." I looked at the woman standing in front of me. I searched deep within my own chest for the familiar, agonizing tug of a mother's guilt. I searched for the desperate instinct to protect my little girl. There was nothing left. She had killed that instinct on the boardroom floor. "You made your choice, Elena," I said softly. My voice was completely steady. "When you thought I was broken, you told me to go to a public charity clinic. You told me I was a liability to your grand new era. You stepped on my neck because you believed you would never, ever need me again. I was wrong." She sobbed, falling to her knees on the scuffed wooden floor. She reached out, trying to grab my heavy gray sweater. "I was manipulated. Please, forgive me." I gently stepped back, keeping my boundaries perfectly intact. "I do forgive you," I replied, "but forgiveness does not mean I will ever trust you again. You chose to build your life on stolen ground. Now, you must learn how to survive the collapse." I slowly closed the heavy wooden door, the metallic click of the lock echoing with total finality, leaving her weeping in the empty hallway. I walked over to the window and looked out at the towering city skyline I had built. A beautifully designed building can withstand the most violent storms, but only if the foundation is made of absolute truth. I finally let the fragile ruins of my past wash away into the cold rain. The architect inside me is now entirely at peace, quietly drafting a completely new tomorrow.